welcome to another episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark 7, and as always, I'm glad to have you with me here again for another discussion of military history. Before we begin with our topic today, I'd like to wish my listeners a Happy New Year. Hope you all had an enjoyable holiday. Today we're going to continue with our series on the wartime career of the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Up to now, we've been following the actions of the aircraft and the units operating them in the Pacific against the Japanese Army and Navy. While the great majority of the Dauntless's service took place on this side of the world, they were not absent from the waters of the European theater of war. Today we'll take a look at their service here with the smaller American carrier forces of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. We'll also take a look at their use by the Free French, both during the war and afterwards in their attempts to reassert their control in their former colonial territories. My sources for this one will be Douglas SBD Dauntless by Peter C. Smith, and SBD Dauntless Units of World War II by Barrett Tillman. So with that being said, let's go back to the gray waters of the Atlantic in the winter of 1941, see what the carrier forces of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet were doing as the American war machine began to mobilize in earnest against the Axis powers. Although the story of American carrier aviation in the Second World War took place overwhelmingly in the Pacific theater against the Japanese, American carrier planes, including the Dauntless dive bomber, also saw action against the forces of the European Axis. The operations of the Dauntless squadrons in the Atlantic theater, flying from land bases and carrier decks, were not as spectacular as those of their compatriots on the other side of the war. They nevertheless played an important role in the Allied victory there. The Americans had two fleet carriers in the Atlantic, the USS Wasp and the USS Ranger. Their first foray into the European war took place in the spring of 1942, when Task Force 99, under Rear Admiral R.C. Giffen, was dispatched to the North Sea to reinforce the British home fleet. This task force included the Wasp. Like the Pacific Fleet carriers, this ship fielded two squadrons of dive bombers, both scouting squadrons in her case, VS-71 and VS-72. These squadrons were not equipped with Dauntlesses, however, but with its direct predecessor in frontline service, the Vought SB-2U Vindicator. The Wasp arrived at the British Fleet base at Scapa Flow on the 3rd of April 1942. However, she wouldn't stay there for very long. She was sent, along with her destroyer escort, to the Clyde to take part in the effort to supply fighters to the beleaguered British base at Malta in the Mediterranean Sea. In this mission, the Wasp was not employed as a fleet carrier per se, but rather as an aircraft transport. Her Vindicators were flown off to land at Fleet Air Arm shore bases to make room for 52 tropicalized Spitfire Mark 5B fighters. These fighters were taken aboard on the 12th and 13th of April. The Wasp sailed the next day, commencing Operation Calendar. Covered in the air by the patrolling Wildcats of her fighter squadrons, 49 of the Spitfires were successfully flown off of her decks to land at Takali Airfield on the island. Unfortunately, the Germans had anticipated their arrival, and most of the Spitfires were destroyed on the ground in a Luftwaffe bombing raid within minutes of their arrival. All of the newly arrived Spitfires had been destroyed only 2 days later. The effort was repeated on May 9th, when the Wasp took part in Operation Bowery, delivering 63 more Spitfires. This was the last operation she would take part in the Atlantic. On the 14th, she was back at Scapa Flow, where she took her original planes, including the Vindicators, back aboard and headed for the Pacific, where the deteriorating situation demanded her presence. The departure of the Wasp for the Pacific left the Americans with only one fleet carrier in the Atlantic, the USS Ranger. This 14,500-ton ship was the fourth aircraft carrier the Americans had put into service. She was the first one built as such from the keel up, following the Langley, which was converted from a collier, and the Lexington and Saratoga, which were begun as battlecruisers. Ranger was commissioned on June of 1934. Like many interwar carriers, she was originally built with auxiliary catapults installed on her hangar deck to enable the ship to fly off lighter reconnaissance aircraft while the main flight deck was conducting other operations. These proved impractical and were removed in a later refit. Her normal aircraft complement consisted of about 72 planes, designated Carrier Air Group 4. In mid-1942, this was made up of two fighter squadrons, VF-9 and VF-41, a total of 54 F-4F Wildcat fighters, and one squadron of SBDs, VS-41, which had 18 dive bombers. At the outbreak of war, the Ranger was returning from a patrol off the coast of Africa. She was in the Navy Yard at Norfolk on the 8th, and left on the 21st for a patrol in the South Atlantic. This was uneventful. She then returned to Norfolk in March 1942 for a refit, the course of which she was fitted with one of the first radar systems used aboard a U.S. Navy vessel. Afterwards, she was, like the Wasp, employed in the aircraft transport role, ferrying fighters to Allied bases across the Atlantic. On the 22nd of April, she left Rhode Island with 68 Army P-40 fighters, but she flew off on the 10th of May to land at a British airstrip at Accra on the Gold Coast of modern Ghana. This group of planes continued across Africa and Asia to China to reinforce the American volunteer group, famous Flying Tigers, which were being incorporated into the Army Air Force now that the U.S. was properly in the war. Another such mission was undertaken in July. On the 19th of that month, the Ranger flew off 72 more P-40s to join the 9th Air Force in North Africa. These aircraft form a complete unit, 57th Fighter Group, which would form part of the Desert Air Force and participate in the battle against Rommel's forces at the Second Battle of El Alamein. After these ferrying missions, the Ranger returned to Norfolk, where she engaged in training exercises until the 1st of October. On this day, she departed for Bermuda to meet up with a group of 4 U.S. escort carriers. These were the Sangamon-class vessels, namely the Sangamon, Suwannee, Chenango, and Santee. These 11,500-ton vessels had originally been built as Type T3 oil tankers for civilian service, but had been taken over by the Navy in the months before the war began. In contrast to the American fleet carriers, which were named after famous battles, like the Saratoga and Lexington, or after early wooden vessels of the U.S. Navy, like the Ranger or the Enterprise, these ships, like other American fleet oilers, had been named after American rivers, and they retained these names after they had been converted into flat tops. The purpose of the conversion was to get more air cover for Allied convoys in the Atlantic against the U-boat threat. Range of land-based maritime patrol aircraft was insufficient to cover the convoys throughout their entire journeys across the ocean. Therefore, small carriers of this kind were desirable to travel along with the merchant ships and provide air cover with shipborne fighters and scout bombers. Sangamons were slower than the fleet carriers, with a maximum speed of about 18 knots. They operated a smaller air group as well, with only about 25 to 30 aircraft. The squadrons carried aboard the escort carriers were also smaller than those on the fleet carriers, typically about 9 planes, and had the letter G inserted into their squadron designations. The escort carriers' fighter squadrons were thus designated VGF and then a number, and employed F-4F Wildcat fighters. Scout bombing squadrons were designated VGS, and usually flew Avenger torpedo bomber. Uniquely among the American escort carriers in the Atlantic, the Sangamons also operated SBDs. The Ranger and the 4 Sangamons were organized into a task group and trained together near Bermuda. Together, they operated an air group that was just slightly larger than that fielded by a pair of fleet carriers such as the Enterprise and Hornet that were then operating in the Pacific. Their air group included a higher proportion of fighters than their Pacific counterparts. This carrier task force was slated to participate in the first step back against the Axis by the Western Allies in the European theater, Operation Torch, the invasion of the Vichy French possessions in North Africa. While in numerical terms, the aircraft fielded by this group of carriers was just as formidable as that the Americans had wielded at Coral Sea, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, air groups of the recently converted Sangamons were newly formed and had very little time to train for their new mission. In the most extreme case, the dive bombers of the Santee had been given only a single day's flying and practice bombing from her deck before the group sailed for the African coast. Since the landing beaches were out of range of land-based air support, this was an unusual occasion in the European theater of war, in which a major operation was protected and supported entirely by carrier-based air support. The Torch plan called for 3 landings, one at Casablanca, one at Oran, and one at Algiers. American troops would go ashore first on all 3 beaches, in the hopes that the Vichy French defenders would be less likely to resist U.S. troops than those of the British Army. Landings at Oran and Algiers would be supported by British naval units, and these forces proceeded to the battle area from the British Isles. The American naval forces, including the carriers participating in the operation, were assigned to the Western Naval Task Force, under the command of Rear Admiral H.K. Hewitt. Most of the ships were assembled and heading across the Atlantic by the 25th of October. The carrier group left the Bermuda area on the next day to join them. These proceeded to a point in the ocean located at 40 degrees north latitude, 51 degrees west longitude, and then split up into 3 groups to head towards their respective landing areas. The landing zone of the Western Task Force was centered on Casablanca, stretching south 140 miles or 225 kilometers to Safi, and 70 miles or 113 kilometers towards Rabat and Mahdia in the north. The ships were divided in northern, central, and southern groups, with the largest effort made in the center. More than 100 transports carried the 35,000 men of the U.S. 3rd and 9th Infantry Divisions, as well as 2 battalions of the 2nd Armored. The ground troops were commanded by Major General George S. Patton. 5 carriers were split up to cover each of the landings. 2 of the escort carriers, the Sangamon and the Chenango, supported the northern group. The Sangamon carried 2 squadrons, VGF-26 with 12 Wildcat fighters, and VGS-26, which had 9 Avengers and 9 Dauntlesses. The Chenango did not carry its regular air group, but instead carried 76 of the Army's P-40 fighters to be flown off and operated from captured land bases. The southern group was accompanied by only one of the escort carriers, the Santee, with her 2 inexperienced squadrons aboard. These were VGF-29 with 14 F-4Fs, and VGS-29, another mixed formation of 8 Avengers and 9 Dauntlesses. The center group had the largest naval air component, consisting of the Ranger and the Suwannee. Together they brought a very fighter-heavy air group, with VF-9 and VF-41 flying from the Ranger with a total of 54 Wildcats, and another 29 from the Suwannee's 3 squadrons VGF-27, 28, and 30. The Ranger also brought VS-41, a squadron of 18 Dauntlesses. The Suwannee carried no SBDs, but did have another 9 Avengers embarked. A large proportion of fighters seems to indicate that the primary mission of the American carrier groups was to provide defense against air attack by Vichy French, German, or maybe even Italian planes. Their carrier strike capability, though limited, would also be put to good use. The landings went in on November 8th. The southern group, landing near Safi, consisted of 6,500 men aboard 6 transports. In addition to the Suwannee, the escort included the battleship USS New York, the cruiser Philadelphia, and 6 destroyers. The troops encountered only desultory resistance on the beach itself. Fighting was sporadic, and the town and airfield at Safi was taken at 14:30 hours that afternoon. This weak French response was all to the good, as the French planes at the nearby Marrakesh airfield could have made a great deal of trouble for the inexperienced men of Santee's air group. Her planes met little opposition in the air, although one of her SBDs was engaged by a Vichy French DB-7, with which it exchanged gunfire. The DB-7 was an export version of the American A-20 Havoc twin-engine attack plane, a few dozen of which were in the hands of the Vichy Air Force. This duel thus presented the spectacle of an aerial skirmish in Moroccan skies between 2 Douglas ground attack aircraft. In the afternoon, a strike by 7 of Squadron VGS-29's green dive bombers hit the French planes at Marrakesh, destroying 7 on the ground and badly damaging 4 more. None of these SBDs were lost, though heavy French ground fire damaged 2 of them. One VGS-29 pilot, Ensign Bruce D. Jacques, claimed an air-to-air victory in his Dauntless, shooting down a Potez 63 twin-engine fighter bomber which crossed in front of his plane's nose at point-blank range by chance during the raid. Another airfield, in Shishawa, was attacked on the 11th by a force of 4 Wildcats and 1 SBD, which claimed another 5 planes on the ground. Santee's planes were also sent against Vichy ground troops, and made any French counterattack difficult by hitting units assembling for the counterstroke against Safi and the beachhead. Although none of her planes were lost due to enemy action, the lack of practice of the Santee's air group showed during Torch. 4 of her SBDs were lost due to flying accidents, including that of a squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Joe Ruddy. This officer's plane was written off in a landing accident at the rudimentary airstrip at Safi, which was used by some of the American carrier planes after its capture on the afternoon of the 8th. No fewer than 7 fighters from her similarly inexperienced Wildcat squadron were also lost in operational accidents. This latter circumstance meant that her dive bombers were sometimes escorted by fighters from the Suwannee, flying in from the adjacent central sector, as in the case of the before-mentioned raid on the French bombers at Marrakesh airfield. The northern wing of the landing forces ran into more trouble than their comrades in the southern sector. Aboard 8 transports, 9,000 men of the U.S. 60th Infantry Regiment headed for the shore. Besides the Sangamon and the Chenango, the naval escort included the battleship USS Texas, the cruiser USS Savannah, and 6 destroyers. The initial waves hit the beaches and quickly established a lodgment against little opposition, but confusion as to their actual location relative to their intended landing point resulted in a considerable delay between their arrival and that of the following waves. Nonetheless, the Americans were soon ashore on both sides of the River Media. French defenses in this sector were anchored on the strong position of Port Lyautey, which was situated a short distance up the river. This fortified base included an airstrip and was defended by a battery of 5.5-inch or 140mm guns. It did not fall at the Americans' first attack. It would hold out for the next 2 days. The Vichy forces in the area meanwhile reacted energetically. They were given time to organize a coordinated response by the delays suffered by the Americans in putting their men ashore. French aircraft attacked the landing beaches. A mechanized column was also assembled and sent from the river base towards the beachhead. A strike group from the Sangamon, led by Lieutenant R.Y. McElroy, was flown off to strike the counterattack force while it lay halted in a eucalyptus grove en route. This was composed of a dozen SBDs and Avengers, the latter carrying bombs instead of torpedoes, escorted by 10 Wildcat fighters. These planes repeatedly harassed the French mechanized force with attacks at very low level. The carrier planes returned after rearming, flying multiple sorties against the French troops, eventually inflicting casualties sufficient to persuade the Vichy commanders to give up on their counterattack and retreat back upriver. The dive bombers thus played a key role in preventing a serious threat to the American troops here, who would have been caught in an awkward moment by the French armor and motorized infantry. If they had been hit while still near the beaches and disorganized by the mix-up of the landings, the Allied situation here could have become very dire indeed. The Sewanee, operating with the Ranger in the adjoining central sector, sent her dive bombers to join in the attacks on the French ground forces, and for the next 2 days they and the Sangamon's SBDs pounded enemy positions there. They were very valuable in the close support role, in which their accuracy and rapid response to calls for support reproduced the effectiveness of the Stukas. By the 10th, the greater part of the resistance to the landing force here had been silenced, and the airfield at Port Lyote was in Allied hands. The fight here was not over, though, as the major works at Port Lyote, the heavily protected inner fortress or Casbah, still held out. This had been masked and bypassed by the advancing Allies, but still represented a serious threat, and tied down a proportion of the attacking troops, who were detailed to guard against a sally by its defenders against the flank of the advance. The French position was formidable, and a direct assault would obviously prove costly. Once again, the dive bombers of VGS-26 were called in to deal with the defenders. A devastating precision attack finally broke the back of the resistance here, and on the early morning hours of the 11th, the defenders surrendered the fortress. In the central sector, the Americans went ashore just north of Fadala, 15 miles or 24 kilometers from Casablanca. In this sector, confusion in locating the landing beaches and heavy seas led to delays in landing. Many landing craft were also swamped and lost, including 21 of the 36 that set out from the transport Leonard Wood. These difficulties exposed the troops ashore to severe danger. The French had formidable coastal batteries defending the area. As the morning sky lightened, these guns opened up on the fragile beachhead. Ships of the landing armada offshore, both transport vessels and warships, were also targeted by the shore batteries. Vichy naval forces also stood ready at Casablanca to oppose the landings. As a naval base, Casablanca was second only to Toulon as the most important remaining in Vichy hands. It was also the only remaining French base on the Atlantic. French ships based here included a light cruiser, 9 destroyers including 2 large flotilla leader types, 11 submarines, and about 24 lighter vessels. The 37,000-ton battleship Jean Bart was also docked in the harbor. This formidable vessel was seaworthy but not yet completed. She remained stationary at the quayside during the landings, but her anti-aircraft armament was operable. One of her main battery turrets, with 3 15-inch or 380mm guns, was also operational. The defenses of the base itself included the heavy guns of the El Hank coastal battery, with 4 7.6-inch 194mm and 4 5.4-inch or 138mm guns. These threats together would keep the Dauntlesses here, including Ranger Squadron VS-41, known as the High Hats, along with those of the Sewanee, heavily occupied. Their first airstrike was against shipping and submarines at Casablanca Harbor to prevent their intervention against the landing force. This went off early in the morning on the 8th, but the strike was already too late to stop this threat entirely, as 5 of the French submarines had already departed for defensive stations. Just a half hour after the last of these had cleared the area, at 0730 hours that morning, the center force Dauntlesses, with Avengers and a heavy escort of Wildcats, flew out to neutralize the French naval threat. They were intercepted by Vichy fighters, which shot down 6 of the F-4Fs. The Wildcats did their job, however, and not only knocked down 7 of the enemy planes, but kept them off the dive bombers altogether. The SBDs were able to conduct their attack dives unhindered. They began their attack at 0804 hours, and despite heavy flak from the ship and shore batteries, made their dives unharmed. Their bombs began smashing down among the ships in the harbor. 10 of them, mainly civilian ships and passenger vessels, were sunk in this raid. Some of the dive bombers targeted the submarines, destroying 3 of them, the Amphitrite, Oriade, and the La Psyche, where they lay moored. Another, the Sidi Farouche, was strafed damaged by near misses but managed to get out of the harbor. The remaining Vichy subs managed to escape. Some made torpedo attacks on Allied transports and warships, including the Ranger, but none were successful. One of them, the La Civile, was sunk off of Fidala. As the aircraft withdrew, the American Naval Covering Force, led by the battleship Massachusetts and the cruiser Wichita and Tuscaloosa, engaged the coastal batteries. These returned fire vigorously, the heavy guns at El Hank straddling the American battleship with their first salvo. The 2nd Light Squadron of the Marine Nationale, consisting of the light cruiser Prewar and 6 large destroyers, was also present, in addition to the battleship Jean Bart. This battleship's one operational turret joined in the gunnery duel with the American ships. This potential threat became real when the French ships sorted out to attack the invasion fleet. They sorted in 2 groups. The first group of 3, consisting of the flotilla leader Milan and the destroyers Fougueux and Bolognese, headed out at 0900 under the cover of a smoke screen to hit the transports off of Fidala. They were attacked by the Rangers' fighters, but the SBDs were unable to turn around quickly enough to engage them. They were taken under fire by the American heavy ships, and the escort were all sunk or forced to beach themselves, the Bolognese managing to hold out against the Americans until noon, when she was destroyed by fire from the heavy cruiser Augusta. Before they went down, they were able to sink a single landing craft and scored some direct hits on one of the transports. The 4 remaining French ships made their attack shortly afterwards, led by the Prewar. They were spotted not long after they set out, and a strike by the SBDs was hastily put together to hit them on their way in. The dive bombers claimed near misses on the Prewar and 2 of the destroyers accompanying her. One SBD was lost to anti-aircraft fire, crashing into the sea with the loss of both crew members. These men were the only SBD crew lost in the entire landing operation. As soon as the dive bombers could be rearmed and turned around, they were sent back after the French ships, though their bombing and strafing attacks were once again not sufficient to halt the attack. The 4 French ships then ran into the American surface warships, including the battleship Massachusetts and 4 heavy cruisers. The American ships decimated the French with salvos of heavy 16-inch and 8-inch shells, stopping their advance cold and sinking all but 3 vessels. These were set upon once again by the SBDs, who blasted the survivors. A direct hit was scored on the Prewar, another on the Alcyon. 2 more were landed on the destroyer leader Albatross, which totally wrecked the forward half of the ship and inflicted more than 300 casualties. The crippled ship beached itself to avoid sinking. Decimated, the surviving French ships withdrew to Casablanca harbor. There, the crippled Prewar beached and burned itself out, while the damaged destroyers Brestois and Frondeur both capsized and sank. Out of the squadron's 7 ships, only one of the destroyers, the damaged Alcyon, was still in a fighting condition. There was still the Jean Bart to be dealt with. This battleship, at the side of the quay in Casablanca harbor, was still bombarding the Allies with long-range gunfire from its one operable main battery turret. The Dauntlesses began their attacks on her on the morning of the 9th with 1,000-pound bombs. The first dive bomber went in at 0813 hours and missed. 3 minutes later, another SBD's bomb plunged straight into the French ship, punching through the port side float plane catapult into her quarterdeck, passing all the way through the ship and out the other side. This hit started a bad fire on the upper deck, caused severe flooding as well as locking her helm. Third bomb from this strike impacted on the quay alongside and detonated there, blasting a large hole in the battleship's starboard anti-torpedo bulge. The dive bombers had barely departed the burning Jean Bart when she was brought under fire from the battleship Massachusetts. The American ship pounded the Frenchman with 6 salvos from her 16-inch or 400mm battery, battering her with no fewer than 5 direct hits. The Jean Bart's operational turret sent back 7 rounds at the American dreadnought before damage from the shells of her 5th salvo jammed its rotating gear. 2 more strikes were flown by the SBDs at 12:40 and 12:47 hours. These did little additional damage, but the ship was out of action for the time being. The threat seemingly neutralized, the Dauntlesses were sent against land targets, including the El Hank battery, on the morning of the 10th, beginning with a strike on a Vichy anti-aircraft battery near Onsaba. Despite the heavy pounding taken by the French battleship, her casualties had been surprisingly light. Damage control personnel worked furiously, and in the afternoon they got her main battery turret back in action. The Jean Bart resumed her bombardment of the Americans, becoming involved in an artillery duel with heavy cruiser Augusta. Another mission was organized by the dive bombers of VS-41. Not long after 1500 hours, the squadron left the decks of the Ranger, led by Lieutenant Commander Lee Embry, hit the battleship again. They arrived over Casablanca harbor at 1558 hours and began their attack. The squadron leader went in first, landing his 1,000-pounder close alongside the battleship, smashing into a small water carrier that had pulled up alongside her. This bomb blew the small vessel to pieces, inflicted some minor damage on the battleship. The second SBD missed the ship, its bomb smashing instead into a nearby warehouse and demolishing it. 2 following dive bombers landed the fatal blows. A 1,000-pound bomb hit the Jean Bar on the bow, opening her side plating and bulging out her decks. Minutes later, another punched into the ship in almost exactly the same place as the previous day's hit on the quarterdeck. This bomb caused extensive damage to the ship's superstructure and started a fire. Smoke from this fire was drawn into its main engine room, which had to be abandoned. These hits caused a resumption of the flooding and knocked out the ship's electrical power. Something like 4,500 tons of water poured into the ship, causing her to sink by the stern. Her position in the shallow water at quayside meant that her keel came to rest on the bottom with her deck still above the water. The flood water would soon be pumped out and the ship refloated, but the Jean Bar was out of action, and her part in this battle was over. Once again, her casualties were extremely light for the pasting she had taken. In the entire battle, she lost 22 officers and men killed, and about the same number wounded. Not long after this, a ceasefire was called between the French and the Allies, and combat came to an end. The fighting associated with Torch had resulted in the loss of 9 Dauntlesses, 3 from the Ranger, 2 from the Sangamon, and 4 from the Santee. Only 1 aircrew from the Ranger was lost during the strike on the French cruiser and destroyer force. Much the largest proportion of aircraft losses was caused by accident rather than enemy action. Most of these were the consequence of the relative lack of experience of the dive bomber crews. The Torch landing saw the most extensive use of the SBD in the European theater, but the Dauntless was not finished in the Atlantic after Operation Torch came to an end. After the operations off the African coast ended, the Ranger returned to the U.S. East Coast and underwent another refit at Norfolk. This lasted until January of 1943. She then returned to her fighter transport duties, ferrying more Army fighters to North Africa to replace losses taken in the continuing fighting against the Axis forces there. The lack of Axis naval forces in the Atlantic after 1940, except of course for the U-boats, along with the ability of land-based air power to effectively dominate the Mediterranean and North Sea areas, accounts for the frequent use of the fleet carrier as a transport for land-based planes. Independently operating carrier air groups like those that played such a vital role in the Pacific War were less useful in this operational environment. In August of 1943, Ranger was loaned by the Americans to the British Home Fleet. At that time, there was no British fleet carrier available to serve with this formation. She arrived at Scapa Flow on the 11th, the second U.S. fleet carrier after the Wasp to be based there. First combat operation she participated in with the British was an attempt to sink the German pocket battleship Lutzow. This warship was based at Altenfjord in northern Norway, sailed from there on the 23rd of September, headed for Narvik, the first stop on a voyage down the Norwegian coast, then across the Baltic to the harbor of Gdynia, or Gdansk, in occupied Poland, where she was to undergo a refit. Although the ship's departure and movements were known and reported to the British, squabbling between the RAF and Royal Navy led to repeated delays and finally the cancellation of the effort on the 28th. Lutzow was permitted to make her trip unmolested. The Dauntlesses were denied the chance to add a German battleship to their score, to go along with the Japanese Hiei and the Vichy French Jean Bar. Ranger's planes, however, were to have another chance at striking the Germans in Norwegian waters before the year was out. On the 2nd of October, the Home Fleet, under Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, sortied from Scapa Flow and headed for a position about 140 miles or 225 kilometers off the port of Voda. This was the beginning of Operation Leader, a strike against German shipping concentrated there. The Ranger was covered by 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. This operation would provide one of the few examples of what might be called a classic raid by carrier aircraft in the northern European theater. It was the only one undertaken by the U.S. Navy's aircraft. The target lay above the Arctic Circle, and thus the dive bomber service here represents an extreme contrast in conditions with those faced by their comrades aboard the Hornet and Enterprise, who had fought the Battle of Santa Cruz in the tropical waters of the Bismarck Archipelago around this time the previous year. As we shall see, the Dauntless proved as effective in these frigid skies as it had on the other side of the world. The Ranger's dive bomber squadron, VB-4, was equipped with the newer model of the Dauntless, the SBD-5. The Dash 5 used the more powerful 1200 horsepower Wright R1820-60 engine. Despite this power upgrade, the increasing weight of equipment carried by the dive bombers at this point in the war meant that the increase in performance was marginal. In fact, cruising speed and operational ceiling were actually somewhat less than the preceding Dash 3 and Dash 4 models. Range with payload was also decreased. but this was compensated by the provision of attachment points on the new model for a pair of 58-gallon or 264-liter drop tanks under the wings. The Dash 5 also replaced the 3-power optical sight with the greatly superior Mark 8 reflector sight, which was not only more precise but was not prone to fogging up in the dive. The windscreen heater was also fitted to counteract a similar fogging problem of the pilot's canopy itself. The Ranger Inter Task Force reached the designated flying-off point at dawn on the 4th. The carrier was accompanied by the British battleships HMS Duke of York and Anson, the cruiser Belfast, as well as the American cruiser Tuscaloosa and a mixed force of 11 destroyers. The American planes were launched in 2 attack groups. The main attack on Boda would be carried out by the Northern Attack Group, made up of the dive bombers and a fighter escort. The Southern Attack Group, made up of 10 Avengers and 6 Wildcats, was detailed to hit ships near the town of San Nechon, about 100 miles or 160 kilometers to the south. Unfortunately, the weather at sea level was not ideal, and sufficient wind could not be generated over the carrier's deck to fly off her SBDs with their 1,000-pound bombs. The decision was made to switch these bombs for 500-pounders, and 6 dive bombers were so rearmed before the wind picked up and regular flight operations could begin. All 20 Dauntlesses of VB-4 began taking off at 0718 hours, formation led by Lieutenant Commander G.O. Klinsman. 14 of them still carried the larger 1,000-pound weapons. 8 Wildcat fighters also went with them as escorts. For no fewer than 60% of the crewmen aboard the American planes, this was their first operational sortie. The Dauntlesses flew in 5 4-plane divisions, each composed of 2 pairs. The bombers and their escorts flew most of the 150 miles or 240 kilometers to the target at an altitude of less than 100 feet, 30 meters, to evade detection by the German radar installations on the Norwegian coast. Unusually for this time of year in these high latitudes, the flight was made under clear skies and in good flying conditions. As they reached the lighthouse at Myken, the dive bombers began climbing to attack altitude. One of the 4-plane divisions, along with a pair of the fighters, was detached from the main force to fly a separate approach course towards their target. The main force located enemy vessels at 0830 hours, a large cargo ship Kirkplane, and a tanker, the Schleswig, traveling north at 12 knots under the escort of a minesweeper. 4 planes of the 1st Division made steep attack dives on the cargo vessel. Lieutenant Commander Klinsman made the first attack, scoring a near miss. His wingman, Lieutenant Weeks, followed him down and planted his bomb square midships, blasting the Kirk plane and sending it to the bottom. 4 planes of the following division went after the Schleswig. These planes scored a direct hit on her after section and very close near miss just astern. These shocks jammed her rudder, and the SBDs left her burning, listing badly to port and in a sinking condition. Her crew ran her aground, however, and prevented total loss. She was eventually refloated and taken back to Boda for repairs. Meanwhile, the division that had been detached at Myken found the 8,000-ton freighter La Plata to the south of the town of Amno. The first pair of SBDs made shallow diving attacks on the ship, releasing their weapons at very low level, barely 60 feet or 18 meters in the case of the first plane, which was lucky to escape unharmed from its own bomb's explosion. The first bomb plunged into the sea just ahead of the freighter and blew up under her bow. The second dive bomber scored a direct hit amidships, but the bomb failed to detonate and was deflected by the impact, falling into the sea close to the port side, where it detonated. The ship seemed disabled by the 2 close near misses, and as a result, the remaining pair of this division declined to attack her, flew on to the harbor at Boda to meet up with the rest of the force. Here they made shallow 30-degree dives on another freighter, coming in at just over 200 knots. Their bombs blew a large hole in the starboard side of the target ship under the waterline. Shallow dives made by the inexperienced dive bomber crews in these attacks exposed them to greater dangers from the German flak. One of the SBD crews of this pair paid the price for this. A plane of Lieutenant Junior Grade C.A. Tucker was hit repeatedly at an altitude of 200 feet, or 60 meters, and bored into the sea, with the loss of both crewmen. The remaining 8 Dauntlesses of the main group proceeded to Boda and made their attacks on the shipping in the harbor. These also dived on their targets at a shallow angle and took damage from the flak of the ships and the shore installations. One ship, the ore carrier Rabat, was sunk. Another cargo vessel, the Cap Guir, was crippled. The smaller ships Malaga and Ibis received minor damage, the former from a near miss and the latter from strafing. Another SBD, crewed by Lieutenant Junior Grade S.R. Davis and his backseater D.M. McCarley, was hit in the engine and forced to ditch. Both men were seen scrambling into their rubber dinghy. Presumably they were captured by the Germans. 4 more planes were shot up, but remained able to form up with the rest of the Rangers' planes and return to the carrier. No German aircraft were seen, and thus no contest between Luftwaffe Messerschmitt 109s and 110s and the American carrier planes took place this day. The results of this strike were very creditable to the American flyers. 5 ships, totaling more than 20,000 tons, were sunk, including a loaded troop ship. 6 more were damaged, 2 of which, including the tanker Schleswig mentioned before, were forced to beach themselves to avoid sinking. Of the sinkings, the SBDs of VB4 were responsible for 2, and shared credit with the third, the before-mentioned La Plata, with the accompanying Avengers, finished her off after conducting their own strikes to the south. 2 of the badly damaged ships were also the work of the dive bombers. The Ranger and VB4 were not quite done with the Germans in the far north. On the 14th, she sailed into the icy Arctic waters again as part of a covering force of Convoy FQ, which carried relief personnel and supplies to the Arctic island outpost of Spitsbergen. This mission was accomplished without incident, and the carrier returned to Scapa Flow on the 22nd. Soon after this, she left British waters for good, heading back to the American East Coast where she would spend the rest of the war as a training vessel, on which hundreds of Navy pilots would earn their wings. She was the only American fleet carrier that never engaged the Japanese. Other SBDs flew in the Atlantic and Caribbean as part of the Allied effort against the U-boats. Some of these, such as VS-41 from the Ranger and VC-29 aboard the Santee, flew from carrier decks. This latter squadron was the same that had participated in the torch landings under the designation of VGS-29. The VC designation stood for Composite Carrier Squadron, as its 9 SBDs flew along with a similar number of Avengers. In fact, the Avenger, especially once it was armed with the so-called Fido homing torpedo, were much more effective in the anti-submarine role than the Dauntless. As a result, the Santee would remain the only Allied escort carrier to operate the dive bombers after the torch operations. The formidable Avengers played a much larger role in the Battle of the Atlantic than the SBD, especially after mid-1943. Most of the SBDs used on anti-U-boat patrols flew from land bases and were armed with a single depth charge. Here, the shorter-range SBDs of the Navy's shore-based squadrons, such as the Atlantic Fleet's VS-37, flew patrols along the convoy routes along the east and west coasts, and in the Caribbean where they were tasked with the protection of oil tanker convoys coming up from Venezuela. Marine squadrons also flew the Dauntless from land bases as part of the anti-submarine effort. The longest serving of the Marine SBD units was VMS-3, which was based at St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. From here, they flew numerous search, patrol, and convoy protection missions from the beginning of the war until the unit was disbanded in May of 1944. This is not the end of the story of the Dauntless in the European theater, however. After torched, some of the French forces returned to the war on the Allied side. With metropolitan France in Axis hands, the Frenchmen could not operate their French-built equipment for long before the lack of spares and consumable supplies put them out of action. Therefore, these so-called Free French forces would need to be equipped with Allied equipment, which, in the case of the air units, meant American planes. The Naval, the aviation branch of the Marine Nationale, requested the SBD to equip its reorganized squadrons. In autumn of 1944, the first batch of 39 Dauntlesses was sent to the French, arrived at Agadir, Morocco. These were organized into 2 squadrons, or flotilles, 3B and 4B, under the overall command of Capitaine de Frigate Francis Lane. These units set about training. This working up was brief. Before long, the French dive bombers were sent to Cognac in the south of France, where they formed part of the newly formed French Atlantic Air Forces, which itself was subordinated to the U.S. 1st Tactical Air Force. The ground crew and staff personnel flew to join them on the 22nd of November, aboard Dakota transports via Foggia in liberated Italy. The 2 Aeronaval squadrons were used to fly missions against the isolated pockets of German troops holding out in fortified areas along the French Atlantic coast. Though the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies, it still opposed its excellent flak defenses against the dive bombers. German air defense here in the Zeroed estuary was the responsibility of Flakabteilung 999, equipped with numerous guns of various calibers, including the deadly Flak Vierling, a quadruple 20mm automatic cannon mounted in permanent emplacements as well as on vehicles. Combined with the excellent German camouflage, these guns made the missions of the French SBDs hazardous and difficult. Their first attack was mounted on the 9th of December, when they were sent to hit German artillery at Verdun. Another heavy attack took place on the 18th, targeting coastal shipping as well as gun emplacements and entrenchments. Between December 1944 and May 1945, the Aeronaval SBDs would fly 24 combat missions, totaling more than 1,400 combat hours and dropping 500 tons of bombs. In addition, 62 sorties for single planes were also flown. They lost 5 of their number in the course of their career, including one flown by Lieutenant Bonnefoy, who was brought down over Saint-Palais by one of the newly introduced German surface-to-air rockets. The Naval was not the only French operator of the SBD. The Free French Air Force, the successor of the Armée de l'Air, also operated the Douglas dive bomber. Like the U.S. Army Air Force, the Free French used the land-based version of the Dauntless, the A-24 Banshee. 50 B-model Banshees, in 2 batches, were sent to French units in Morocco in December of 1943. As we have seen in a previous episode, the B-model Banshee was virtually identical to the SBD-5. Chief differences were the use of Army-type radio gear, instrumentation, weapons, and fittings, as well as the deletion of the carrier-specific equipment such as the arrestor gear and flotation equipment. The Banshees were originally intended only for interim use. The Free French dive bomber units were supposed to be equipped with the Vultee A-35 Vengeance instead, once this newer aircraft became available. However, persistent troubles with the A-35's power plant meant that deliveries were delayed while further development work took place to make the Vengeance operational. Thus, more A-24s were sent instead. By February 1944, 100 had reached the French, and another 100 were being prepared for dispatch to Free French squadrons in North Africa. As they arrived, they were formed into 2 dive bomber groups, the 17th and 18th, each consisting of 2 escadrilles or squadrons of 10 planes apiece. The 17th group, known as the Picardie Group, was moved via Libya to Syria after their training was completed. Here they operated in so-called pacification roles following the collapse of Vichy rule there. The need for the aircraft to perform this colonial role, which involved long flights over inhospitable and inaccessible terrain, left no room for a plane with engine reliability issues. This had been the chief factor that had persuaded the French to accept the A-24 in place of the Vengeance. 25 of the planes were kept at Meknes in northern Morocco, where they were used as advanced trainers. These were very satisfactory aircraft for the tactical training of airmen who would go on to fly P-40s and P-39s, also being supplied by the Americans, in a fighter bomber role. In the spring of 1944, 2 escadrilles of A-24s were assigned to work with the French resistance, or the Maquis, in the southern portions of occupied France. These were intended to fly from North African bases and make precision night drops of arms and supplies to resistance groups. Though this idea proved unworkable, the training continued and airdrops to resistance groups would be carried out by French Banshees later in the war, when these units were stationed in French territory later that year. The French generally conducted their attacks in steep 70-plus degree dives like those used by the U.S. Navy and the French Naval pilots, rather than the shallow 30 to 45 degree dives used by Banshee crews of the U.S. Army squadrons that flew them in the Southwest Pacific. The French A-24s followed the Allied columns as they moved against the Germans after Operations Dragoon and Overlord. Here they were used, like their Naval counterparts in the Atlantic Coast region, to reduce pockets of German forces cut off by the advancing armies. They were based at Bourges in central France, then moved northwest to Vannes in Brittany, where 16 of them conducted operations from the front near Saint-Ouen. 4 A-24s of Group 1-18 Vendée mounted the first strike from here, against the German fortress troops trapped at Lorient. They continued to hit the Germans as they were pushed northwards. On the 1st of November 1944, Group Vendée staged a major attack on the bridge at Belts. In this mission, the leader of the group's first escadrille, Captain Boucherie, was lost to German flak. As had been the case in the Gironde estuary, the Germans attempted to compensate for their lack of fighter defense with heavy concentrations of flak. 5 of the French Banshees were lost by the first week of January 1945 in these fast-paced operations. In addition, wear and tear on the machines from the constant action led to the withdrawal of much of the dive bomber group to a quieter sector near the Italian frontier area. The remaining serviceable Banshees were concentrated in a single escadrille, which remained in Brittany. This squadron kept 6 Banshees in the air. These continued to fly numerous missions against scattered pockets of German resistance, relocating to southern France as German resistance in the north came to an end. Missions against targets from the Spanish border to the Alpine frontier were flown up to the end of the war. April 1945 saw them undertake repeated raids against the German holdouts at Royan, in the southern portion of the Atlantic coast, and at Grave, in the Alps. Despite the prevailing opinion of both American and British Air Force leaders that the Dauntless and the Banshee were obsolete in Europe, the Free French found it quite serviceable in the battle to liberate their homeland. One of the pilots, speaking in comparison with other Allied fighter bomber types, says this, quote, "The A-24 was far more maneuverable in aircraft, so we were able to dive closer and to pinpoint our heavily defended targets more accurately. This statement must be qualified by the proviso that the lack of Luftwaffe fighter opposition may have changed this assessment. However, experience against the scarcely less effective fighters of the Japanese Navy and Army in the battles in the Pacific indicates that the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would have not been any more capable of preventing the dive bombers from performing their dangerous missions." The end of the war found the French with 7 Banshees remaining in combat units, 6 of which were in flyable condition. The 25 advanced trainers at Meknes remained in commission, and would continue to serve there until 1953. A few other A-24s were used for training in air gunnery at the School of Cazaux, while others served with the colonial gendarmerie in Morocco to fly police missions over the desert in the manner of the interwar air control operations of the imperial powers. The career of the Dauntless in French service did not end with the Second World War. The legacy of imperialism did not disappear with the end of the war, and the efforts of the French to reassert control over the lost colonial territories in Indochina would see Dauntlesses once again aboard carriers in the Pacific. The people of the former French possessions in Indochina, after the defeat of the Japanese, were not eager to return to the control of the imperial power. The national liberation movement under communist leadership disputed the French on their return. The Viet Cong, the military wing of this movement, rose up and conducted a highly effective guerrilla war against the French. Thus the French, which had so recently conducted their own guerrilla resistance against the Germans, found themselves in the reverse role of suppressing resistance to their rule in Vietnam and the surrounding territories. Part of their military response was brought to the theater aboard the carrier Die Schmude. This ship had previously been the British escort carrier HMS Biter, which had been transferred to the Marine Nationale in the closing days of the war. Like the American escort carriers we mentioned before, this ship carried smaller-sized squadrons of about 8 or 9 planes, in this case one of ex-British sea firefighters, and another, known as Flotille 3F, with 9 SBD-5s. When fighting in Indochina broke out on December 9th of 1946, the Die Schmude was sent to the scene, arriving off the northern portion of Vietnam in the beginning of February 1947. The Die Schmude herself was less than ideal for operation of the Dauntless. She had very limited hangar space to accommodate the dive bombers, which were not equipped with folding wings. She lacked catapults of sufficient power to reliably launch the planes, and was capable of a maximum speed of only 16.5 knots, which made it difficult to generate sufficient wind over the deck to assist them in lifting off. These obstacles meant that the Dauntless could not be used to maximum effect from the small carrier. These limitations also go far to explain why the Dauntless was so little used aboard Allied escort carriers in the Second World War, and why the more powerful Avenger, which, though considerably larger, did have folding wings, was preferred. The SBDs of Flotille 3F, therefore, operated mainly from shore bases at Tonkin during the 3 years of their involvement in the Indochina War. The Die Schmude only remained in the area for a couple of months, then left to return to Toulon on the 14th of April to refit, but also to embark and bring more Naval dive bombers. She sailed once again for Indochina in September with Flotille 4F under Lieutenant de Vassal Millet. She reached Vietnamese waters on October 20th. 3 of the 9 Dauntlesses she brought were sent to join the others in Tonkin, while the other 6 were sent to Cochin, China. By the end of November, they were taking part in the opening battles in central Annam. Afterwards, they flew during the Battle of Tan Son Nhut, part of the campaign in the Plain of Jars. 2 squadrons flew numerous sorties against the guerrillas in the Red River region throughout the year. The intensive use of these aging planes wore them out by the end of March 1948, and they flew their last sortie. They were replaced by more dive bombers purchased from the Americans. These came aboard another ex-British carrier, the Arromanches, formerly the HMS Colossus. This vessel had also been purchased to reinforce the Naval in the Far East. She arrived off Indochina on the 29th of November 1948. Among other planes, she brought 10 more SBD-5s to join the squadrons in Vietnam. The new planes made their operational debut on the 11th of December. These planes flew mainly from the Tonkin region, marking up 56 combat missions and accumulating 300 hours of combat flight time. However, these planes were old and were worn out after only a month of intensive service. On the 5th of January 1949, they were re-embarked on the Arromanches to be returned to France. During their time in Vietnam, the French Navy dive bombers suffered only one loss in action, and that was to a flying accident rather than to enemy action. This was the end of the combat service of Ed Heinemann's highly successful dive bomber design, more than a decade after the first SBD-1s joined the squadrons of the U.S. Marine Corps. And that, I think, is where I will end this episode. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. The story of the Dauntless in the European theater is much less well known than its spectacular service in the Pacific, but it presents an aspect of the dive bomber story that indicates how the Navy's air groups might have been used if the war had been fought against the European Axis alone. In my next episode, we'll take another look at an example of war production from the book Arsenal of Democracy. This time, we'll briefly examine the production program of naval landing craft. These humble but vital vessels were instrumental in the many amphibious operations undertaken by the Allies in all theaters of the war. They underwent a great deal of development and specialization in the war years, almost all of which was actually performed after the fighting had begun. So I hope you'll join me for that. Until then, as always, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.